My name is Kimi Barrett. I am a research and policy analyst with Headwaters Economics. Headwaters Economics is an independent, nonpartisan research group. We're based in Bozeman, Montana. We work with communities across the country on really diverse, complex challenges, one of which is wildfire. And through our wildfire research, we do manage the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, the CPAP Program. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. But I was asked to talk about community resilience and what is being done at that local scale to address and mitigate wildfire risk, primarily through the lens of land use planning. But before I do so, I think it's very important that we step back for a moment and think really closely, deliberately about what we mean with community resilience. Because very often in the natural hazard and disaster literature, as Professor Mann mentioned, what we're actually talking about is a very intentional shift beyond resilience and moving towards community adaptation. In other words, we don't want communities to merely absorb a shock from a natural disaster like wildfire. We want them to learn to live alongside it and anticipate it as an inevitability of the landscape. Because like it or not, wildfires are inevitable. Professor Mann just talked about this, as well as Steve Pine. We do know that they're going to happen, and to assume that we can suppress all wildfires is a costly and deadly mistake. Despite their inevitability, however, I also want to assure you that wildfire disasters don't have to be. And this is really important, and it builds off the work of our good friend, Dr. Jack Cohen. We do know how to build homes and communities to not just withstand a wildfire, but to survive it. And that's what I'll be talking to you today about. So I want to give you a little bit of a teaser and a preview about what I'm referencing here. What you're looking at is a duplex of a home that's been built in a large laboratory hangar by our research partners at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And on the left side of the home, you're seeing a version that's been built with traditional building products, really prevalent in Southwest Montana, but really common across the Intermountain West. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing a version that's been built with ignition-resistant building materials. And at the same time, the entire structure is being exposed to these large ember chambers, which are hurling and projecting thousands of embers at the home. And they're just testing to see which products and which components are burning first. So what are the most vulnerable features of a home to wildfire? So let's see what happens. We're about 4 minutes into the demonstration so far. And already you can see that the bark mulch on the left side of the home has ignited. It's highly flammable. It's a large surface area, not surprising, but it's starting to build in intensity and size. And as it does so, it catches the junipers and the shrubs on fire, which are up against the house. This in turn lights the cedar siding on fire, and it starts to climb vertically up the side of the home and into the open eaves of that roof line and in through the attic vents. It's creating its own little weather system now. It's moving horizontally underneath the decking material, which is also made of wood, catching that on fire from underneath. When that deck catches on fire, it's going to expose the wooden door on fire. At the same time, the whole house on the left is built with single pane windows, meaning that those windows are going to burst under any intense heat and allow flames directly into the interior of the home. On the right-hand side, alternatively, not a lot is going on over here. This is built with fiber cement siding, a metal door, decking material that's been treated for ignition resistance, rock mulch. There's no landscaping up against the home. The windows are all double pane, it's closed eaves and soffits, and the attic vents are 1/8 inch, meaning that no embers can come inside. They repeated this experiment 3 different times with the same results every time. The home on the left was consumed in flames within 10 minutes, while the home on the right survived with minimal smoke damage. So we do know how to do things better. We do know how to build safer, smarter homes in wildfire-prone areas. And so what I want to do today, very quickly, is give you an understanding of how a home burns down in the first place. And then with this knowledge, how do you start to identify those strategies and opportunities for enhanced community resilience and ultimately community adaptation at that local level? So let's take a look at this a little bit closer. How does a home burn down in the first place? And so let's pull back and look at the larger profile and narrative of wildfire behavior on the landscape. And so this is a hypothetical community in a wildfire-prone area, likely in Montana or in California, and a wildfire breaks out in the backcountry. At this point, it's considered a wildland fire. It's not a big threat because there's no structures in harm's way. However, given predominant winds and terrain, it does start to move downslope. And ultimately, it starts to threaten those immediate structures adjacent to the wildland vegetation. And at this point, it's considered a wildland-urban interface fire or wildland-urban fire. And when you're talking about the sequence of events that eventually leads to a larger urban conflagration or wildfire disaster, this is really your area of concern. It's more or less your unit of analysis when you're talking about how a wildfire disaster happens. And so unlike popular narratives of this large flame front coming through a community and razzing it to the ground, it's actually those embers that are a main culprit behind home loss and result in a majority of destruction during a wildfire event. Because in all actuality, the scene I've just highlighted here where the structure is adjacent to that wildland vegetation looks much more like this during a wildfire event. It's an ember storm or fire brands. It's exactly what you just saw in that demonstration. It's thousands and thousands of fireballs being hurled through the air as much as a mile, if not more, in front of a wildfire event. And if they land on any flammable surface, they're going to start their own small spot fire and grow in intensity and size to ultimately threaten a structure. So think a moment about what a home essentially is and what's flammable on it. You're talking about a bunch of petroleum-based products that are wrapped in a chemically treated wood and then insulated with a highly flammable plastic and then placed in a dry, overstocked forest. And then you're going to put things like firewood or a propane tank on top of a deck made of wood and then surround it with bark mulch and dead debris vegetation. As Dr. Mann said, it's not rocket science. This home is going to burn. And when it burns, the radiant heat from it, coupled with surface fire and ember transport, is enough to threaten nearby structures. And when multiple homes are burning at once, it's going to quickly overwhelm any firefighting forces, and it can lead to the urban conflagration or wildfire disaster. And you see this evidenced over and over in post-fire analysis, where the structure is still burning amidst this green vegetation, as Steve Pine pointed out earlier. And it suggests, again, that once that one home starts to burn, it proliferates through the town, and each community can start to burn as a result of that initial home ignition. Therefore, in order to break that sequence of events that leads to that urban conflagration, it's absolutely essential that you reduce home vulnerabilities within the structure itself, as well as the immediate landscaping, in order to reduce community risk reduction. And this is absolutely crucial that you consider that home as part of that analysis. Equally, here's the crux behind that, though. It requires 100% compliance. One home alone is not going to achieve community risk reduction. It has to be ubiquitous across a neighborhood and a larger community. And so this is where land use planning tools can help. And by land use planning, I'm talking about the basic measures and options within the land use planning toolkit that can be used to integrate risk reduction into the planning and development process. Things like a WUI code or building code, regulations, bonuses, standard or ordinances that can integrate risk reduction into how a community envisions growing and developing. And this is really the core of the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, the CPAP program. Through this effort, we provide communities with 4 essential services like land use planning recommendations, hazard assessments calibrated at the local level, capacity building events, and then customized research and science to elevate understanding and dialogue about where wildfire risk is occurring alongside increasing development pressure. So far, we've worked with over 70 communities across the country to varying degrees. And I'm going to walk through Austin, Texas as an example of how the CPAP process unfolds on that local scale. So Austin is really interesting. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and yet it has one of the highest housing stocks exposed to wildfire. There's a long legacy of racial segregation that has placed some populations at adverse risk to wildfire over others. And historically, the city has responded with prescribed burns and a strategic open space policy. And then in 2016, they applied and were accepted into the CPAP program. And we provided them a set of land use planning recommendations that integrated risk reduction into how the city envisioned growing alongside that increasing risk and development. In 2018, we also provided them with a vulnerable populations tool. And so this tool allows the city to identify where populations are most at risk to wildfire. And so a user can filter through various demographic variables and understand where they need to start directing resources accordingly. For example, if you need to produce outreach materials in multiple languages based off English proficiency, or where evacuation is going to be challenged by mobility and transportation limitations. And then ultimately in 2020, the city did finally adopt a WUI code based off our initial recommendations. And as part of that, the WUI code requires that all homes built in high hazard areas include ignition resistant construction materials, that they have to be tempered or dual paned windows, attic vents have to be 1/8 inch or smaller, defensible space or vegetation management is required on all properties, and the WUI code applies to all structures within the high hazard area. So this is an example where the planning process can work to reduce wildfire risk through the development framework. And so in closing thoughts, I want to again assure you that this is a solvable problem. As Steve Pine said, we've done this before, we can do it again. We've done it now for decades with earthquake-resistant structures. We've also done it now with hurricane-resistant structures, playing around with different architectural designs and building materials to understand how they can withstand gale force winds and rising sea surge. And we've done it with wildfire-resistant buildings. This is a home that was built to ignition-resistant standards in Paradise, California. It survived while 14,000 of its neighbors burned down. So we do know how to do things better and smarter. We also know that thousands of communities need these services and that they cannot do it on their own. They need our help and yours. So we're hoping you can join us.